Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is Troy with Cichlid Bros. In today's video, we are discussing how to keep the Mdoka White Lips. This is another awesome African cichlid with some really unique characteristics, so I'm really excited to talk about it. Let's dive right in. So the Mdoka White Lips is an African cichlid from Lake Malawi, part of the haplochromis family, and it specifically is a Placidochromis, so they have a couple really close relatives in the star sapphire and the deepwater hap, which we've done care guides on as well, so leave that down in the description below. But they are no doubt one of my favorite Placidochromis species and African cichlid in general. Being a haplochromis species, they are a pretty big African cichlid. They're more of the common hap and not as big and boisterous as more of the predatory haps like my brother Alec has in his 220. But here in my 135, I had the Mdoka White Lips. That's probably about 5, maybe 6 inches right now, but you can obviously see where it got its name. The Mdoka White Lips has the very unique characteristic of those lips sticking out, the white coloration with a mostly blue-based body, so the white lips really stick out, and it is a very cool thing to see in your tank, especially in an African cichlid tank, just to have a little more variety in the shapes and characteristics that you have in your tank. But the Mdoka White Lips gets about 8 inches in length, so it gets to be a pretty good size, especially the males. The females might be an inch or two smaller, but maybe the best thing about the Mdoka White Lips is that the females also have really good blue color, and they'll also get the white lips. They might get a little bit of reddish pink coloration in those lips as well, or around the jaw, once they reach their full maturity at around 6 to 7 inches. But in general, both the male and the female will have great blue coloration right away, so you won't have to wait a very long time for them to color up like you do with some of the other haplochromis species. But being from Lake Malawi, they share similar water parameters as other African cichlids with pH anywhere above 7. If you get up to 8 or a little higher, that's probably better for them, especially if they're wild caught, and they do prefer harder water. But for the most part, if you're getting tank bred species, I wouldn't recommend chasing parameters, just keeping things consistent and you should be just fine. You could do something like aragonite or crushed coral, which could keep your parameters a little higher for the African cichlids without having any big swings, any drastic changes, which could be a really good option for your African cichlids. And for temperature, I would say anywhere from 76 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit, so definitely get a heater. Make sure you have some good filters and some good flow in the tank. I would recommend wave makers for almost all African cichlids, especially peacocks and haps. And the tank size probably needs to be over 125 gallons once they're adults. You can keep them in a smaller tank when they are smaller and growing out, but eventually get that bigger 6-foot tank if you can. And if you're doing a small breeder group, you might be able to get away with the 55 or 75 gallon tank short term, but eventually I think you'll need that larger tank. A big factor in that is not only their size, but also in their swimming behaviors. They are big time open water swimmers, just like most haps and peacocks, and that's why the tank setup I have here is very different from my other American cichlid tanks, where these guys need less territories to claim. If there's too much decor in the tank, they could become a little more territorial, and they need that open water swimming space anyway, so definitely just keeping a light aquascape is probably best for these guys. Just enough aquascape for some of its tank mates, like any catfish or bottom dwellers that you may have, or for a fish that's getting bullied to kind of get away. For the most part, keep that tank open, and the fish themselves are really the decor anyway, having that awesome color. You really get everything you need from the fish themselves when it comes to some of your peacocks and haps. And then when it comes to tank mates, I really like the other Placidochromis we talked about, but I also really love peacocks with them because they have similar temperaments. The Mdoka White Lips really isn't overly aggressive, similar to the deepwater hap or the star sapphire or some of the peacocks. They can kind of fight for their hierarchy or spot in the tank, but usually it won't be too aggressive and they'll be just fine. Sometimes they might have some conspecific aggression if they see anyone in the tank that looks kind of like them, so I am kind of gambling a bit having the blue dolphin and the star sapphire, which looks pretty similar, but for the most part it should be just fine, especially if the rest of the tank setup is appropriate. But in general, they are a pretty peaceful African cichlid, and other tank mates that they could go with, they can maybe go with the predatory haps like Alec has in his 220, but that's kind of a risky move, and I think they do better with some of the other smaller haps or the peacocks. And then on the smaller end, the Mbuna from Lake Malawi can be a little feisty and aggressive. It could definitely be done, especially if you have a really large tank with kind of habitats for each, but it can be a tricky thing that I would only recommend for advanced fish keepers. Similar to keeping American cichlids with them, it would be a really big challenge because they do have such a specific tank setup requirement, minimal decor, and just differing diets as well. And they'll definitely be aggressive to any very small tank mates, so definitely avoid any of your smaller community fish or shrimp, as they would definitely be eaten by the Mdoka White Lips, just like any other African cichlid. And they also would probably shred up any live plants you put in the tank, so that's why it's really difficult to put live plants. You could maybe do like pothos on top of the tank or in the sump, or I do have a clear water algae scrubber which helps reduce nitrates, but in general that probably won't be enough nitrate removal to avoid water changes completely. So I would recommend keeping your nitrates below 40 parts per million, hopefully below 20 parts per million, and that'll usually mean some regular water changes, maybe on a weekly basis, just to keep those nitrates in check. And when feeding the Mdoka White Lips, I would just recommend something high in protein, so pellet food, slow sinking pellets that are high in protein. Just look for that top ingredient being something protein based and not really like that fish meal or fish wheat. And you could also mix in some flakes, some live food like brine shrimp would be perfect for them. Maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks do that. And you could also add in some veggie matter just to round out their diet, but in general they will attack almost any food you put in the tank. It's always very fun to feed this tank and just watch the African cichlids go at the food. And I could put in a good amount of sinking pellets and they'll eat it very quickly. Within the first 20 seconds it'll all be gone. And the Mdoka White Lips will also interact with the substrate a bit, similar to the deep water hap. They will scour the substrate a little bit, looking for that uneaten food, and they'll kind of keep that substrate clean, but they also might move some sand around and make some piles in your tank, similar to what I got going on in my 135 here. But when breeding the Mdoka White Lips, it's super easy, just having a male and female in the tank. The female will be a mouth brooder, taking the eggs and the fry into her mouth, and then you could either remove the female to have her spit those eggs and fry into a new tank to raise them, or you could just let nature take its course. But either way, if you have a lot of other tank mates in there, those fry probably won't last. The other thing to keep in mind with the Mdoka White Lips is it's pretty difficult to tell the difference between male and female, because the female will have the really good blue color with white lips just like the male. The female will be slightly less aggressive and maybe slightly smaller, but it's really hard to tell unless you vent them. The best tip if you're trying to breed them is just to get a breeder group of maybe 6 to 7 of them in a 75-gallon tank or larger, and you should have a pair to form pretty naturally in that tank. But sometimes it can be really difficult to tell the difference between male and female, which can be a challenge if you're looking to breed, but it's also a really good thing because if you do have females, they have that awesome color that you get with the males. But overall, the Mdoka White Lips is a really awesome African cichlid with the unique characteristics of having that really solid blue color, colorful females, and both having that really cool protruding white lips that gives you a really unique dynamic in an African cichlid tank. As long as you keep some of those basic care requirements in mind, you should have no issue keeping the Mdoka White Lips. They're a relatively hardy African cichlid, and they're definitely a rewarding one to keep that I would highly recommend. But if you have any questions, make sure to leave those down in the comments section below. Always happy to help and talk fish. But thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.